Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Pippa Crerar. Now, Pippa is the political editor of the Daily Mirror, and she's normally based in Parliament. She was previously the political editor at The Guardian, and before that spent a decade covering London and Westminster politics for the Evening Standard. Pippa, it's great to welcome you. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Whereabouts in the world do we find you today, Pippa?
I'm actually in Glasgow, which is, I'm a Scot, as you can probably hear from my voice. I've still got a bit of an accent, and my parents are up here, but also it's obviously election day when we're recording this. So it's really interesting for me as a Scot to be back in my homeland, where obviously this set of elections is of huge importance potentially for the Union in the in the years ahead. So I feel like I've got a really good vantage point on it all, and one that is perhaps bit different from my normal vantage point at Westminster.
It's certainly gained a bit more media attention than maybe in the south of the border. You'd barely know in Burnley that the local elections are going on. It's been all rather timid and quiet. Do you think it's what makes it so significant, would you say, in Scotland?
Well, because ultimately the SNP, who are expected to form the next government, as obviously they've been in power already, it comes down to whether they're going to be able to form a majority on their own without the support of the Greens. And if they do that, Nicola Sturgeon's made it very clear that it gives them a mandate to push for a second independence referendum. And things are very different from the last referendum, which obviously the staying in the UK side won. Because that was pre-Brexit, and Scotland overwhelmingly voted against Brexit. So there's been sort of big constitutional shifts anyway, and the SNP's argument is that the sort of the appetite for referendum is again upon us. Now I think everyone agrees that nobody wants that sort of that sort of major change to take place during the pandemic, and we have to be through that first. But it is interesting because even though these elections are obviously, like all elections, about who runs the health service and the schools and so on, there's this overarching question in Scotland that if the SNP get their majority, then they'll see that as a mandate for another referendum. So more change ahead potentially.
Pippa, how's the job as political editor been impacted by COVID? I mean, for the Senate, we'd probably just say you sit in an office somewhere and you just kind of do it all from there. I know that's not the case, but
yeah,
it's a bit of a problem for you.
Well, I think this is sort of the personal level and the professional level. And the personal level for me, like many people, has involved being at home a lot more. And during certainly the sort of the two lockdown periods last spring and again this spring, at home all the time. And I've got 3 young children and a dog and a husband and, all the sort of stuff that goes with having a big, busy family. And so for me personally, it's been quite a juggle, because whereas previously I'd work quite long hours in Westminster and maybe wouldn't see so much of my kids in the evenings, now they're there the whole time. So there's a silver lining to that, but of course that makes the sort of concentrating on deadline, kids will get home from school, I'm desperately trying to file this story, sometimes a bit stressful. But professionally, it's obviously also been a big shift. It's been very strange to, lots of our stories are picked up by sort of wandering around Westminster and bumping into politicians and a bit of gossip in the bars, and all the things that people think about it are true. And you've not been able to do that. It's impossible to gossip by appointment in quite the same way. You have to rely heavily on your contacts, but you don't necessarily bump into them in the same way. And then, of course, there's been this whole sort of different approach to things being announced with the press conferences, the number 10 press conferences, which during the first lockdown, I think last year became quite a sort of moment in many people's day. They tuned into the telly at 5 o'clock and see what was going on. And then they've waxed and waned a bit. We've had them obviously a bit more the last few months again. But it's been interesting because that's enabled the government to go straight into people's living rooms rather than sort of through the prism, if you like, of the media. And we've had to think quite carefully about how we deal with questions, which are done over Zoom, and you can't have follow-ups, you can't sort of put your hand up and wave furiously. It's much more, it's very stage managed by number 10. That's been quite difficult for us. And in the very early days, when, if you remember back to the start of the pandemic, Parliament wasn't sitting for a best part of a month. So there was none of the scrutiny that was going on that would normally happen during normal parliamentary times.
Yeah.
And almost like the press had to take on this extra role of almost being like want to sound so grand as saying with the opposition, but certainly in terms of holding the government account, it felt even more important because the opposition politicians weren't there to be able to do that. So, so it's been a very different way of working. Some of it great, some of it really hard.
Yeah, and just reflecting on the COVID situation from a government perspective, Pippa, do you think the government will generally be satisfied with how things have played out for them as a government, or not?
I think this is a question of two parts, isn't it? Because certainly, as far as the public was concerned, as far as the press was concerned, and as far as many in government were concerned, the government's handling of the pandemic initially was pretty dire, and there were all sorts of early errors. I think that the public felt, for the most part, you can't obviously sort of, broad brush doesn't apply to everybody, but for the most part felt that this was an unexpected phenomenon and that it was not something that the government had any experience of. And like all governments around the world, they had a huge amount to deal with. They were dealt a very bad card. And so therefore, from the beginning, there was a sort of a degree of sympathy and support that came with that. But yes, they had a bad card. My personal view is that they then played it badly. And I think as time went on, as we came out from that first lockdown, I think a lot of people felt that that was the case. You know, decisions about when to loosen up, trying to get people back to work in August, the decisions that we now know, thanks to Dominic Cummings, some of the sort of the disputes about whether there should be a proper circuit breaker in the autumn. Obviously there wasn't, there was a delay then, and then all the mess around Christmas and whether people should be meeting or not, and then only finally into the full lockdown in the spring. And when you consider that, I think people gave the government the benefit of the doubt for the first lockdown, the first wave, and when it came to the second one, I think they felt that the government should have learned lessons, and they hadn't. And you know, when you consider that more than half the COVID deaths that have taken place since then, you know, it's really serious. It's decisions which had literally fatal consequences in some cases. And then you've got all the sort of issues about, you know, Tory links with firms which ended up getting lucrative contracts for PPE, all the decisions around care homes in the first wave, schools and how and when they came back. And I think if you've been sort of, you know, Christmas and looking back, the general consensus is that the government has handled the pandemic badly, and certainly people I spoke to in government, the more self-aware ones, recognised that. Fast forward almost 6 months, and the big difference is the vaccination rollout. And it is undoubtedly the case that the government is experiencing a vaccine bounce. I think that they do deserve credit for the procurement side of that, setting up the task force. I mean, you can say, oh, anybody in government would have done the same. We don't know that because nobody else was in government. But I think that they do deserve credit for that, Kate Bingham and her team. And you know, it's put us in a very fortunate position where we've got access to all these different types of vaccines. And the rollout is, I mean, I know the government likes to take credit for it, but let's face it, it's the NHS, which is done fantastically. They've got some experience of mass vaccine programs with flu vaccine over the last decade or so. But nevertheless, it's been done on a scale and at a speed like no other vaccination program. And you know, I've had one of my vaccines, you probably had one of yours, and going to those centres and seeing the number of volunteers and medical students and NHS staff on the days off, all sort of weighing in and being part of this is really quite, I mean, I find it quite emotional. I don't know about you, but going in and seeing how hard people were working to basically protect us as a population. And as we continue to see what's going on in other places around the world, India being the most notable example of right now, but of course there are others that we hear less about, it becomes even starker to me just how fortunate we are in the West that we've got these access to the vaccines and we've got these health systems in place that can protect us. So if you're in government now, you feel you've been given a second chance. You know, they screwed up last year, and this has been their opportunity to recover from that. And you know, they're not going to waste it. And so we've seen a much more cautious approach to emerging from lockdown, and we've seen the vaccine bounce. I think we'll see that to some extent. We'll see that in the election results that will come in tomorrow. And you know, if you're in government at the moment, you're probably feeling that you're in a much better place.
Yeah. I was talking to, and certainly your point about India, it's very sobering, isn't it? And, you know, it's a stark warning to us as a nation to kind of keep on our toes, most certainly. I was talking to John McDonnell just a few days ago, and his biggest frustration with Boris is that he felt he's getting away with it, and he's not actually allowing himself to be scrutinised by media. In your position, Pippa, is that a frustration you share as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was an interview with Nadim Zahawi, the vaccines minister, on the Today programme the other day. And the presenter, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Martha Kearney or so, it was Martha Kearney, I think, at the beginning of the interview made the point that they'd invited all the party leaders in the run-up to the elections, and they'd invited the Prime Minister on, and he alone had refused to come on. And I sort of looked around and realised that he hadn't been on Sky for an interview, he hadn't done with GMB or ITV, Channel 4, none of the major broadcasters, or indeed the newspapers have had proper sit-down interviews with the Prime Minister in the run-up to the elections. And it's exactly what they did in the run-up to the general election in 2019. And their view is, why risk it? If we can get the Prime Minister to speak direct to the country, either through clips to the media, clips, sort of TV clips played on the 6 o'clock news, or through social media. He does videos on the Twitter, number 10 Twitter account. Well, not, sorry, the Tory Twitter account, obviously, if it's the elections, or Facebook, then they think that it's better than risking him putting his foot in it and saying something a bit too flamboyant or colourful or buccaneering, which might not strike the right chord. So, but it's incredibly frustrating for us because it feels that we're being denied denied an opportunity to scrutinise and challenge. And he is able to say what he wants directly to people. You can understand why they might like that, the Tories and the government. But I think in a democracy, having a free press and free media that holds the government to account is absolutely key, and we're too often denied that.
Yeah, but I suppose from his point of view, in the Conservative Party, they've got you where they want you, haven't they? Because despite Cushion Gate, Curtain Gate, whatever we call it, he seems to be a bit like, reminds me of Teflon Tony, that not much sticks at the moment. And as we record this around the time of the local elections, if there was a general election tomorrow, I'm not convinced there'd be a huge difference in the result. What's your thoughts?
No, I think you're right. I think politics has been frozen in aspic for the last year because of the pandemic. So actually, we're not that much further forward than we were straight after that massive Tory election victory, which was Labour's worst defeat in 85 years. I think there's two things. I think one is that you say not much sticks just now, Alex, but actually not much has ever stuck on Boris Johnson. I remember when he was mayor and I was covering him at the Evening Standard in London. A lot of it is sort of priced in because he doesn't moralise necessarily about his own personal life or indeed about others' lives. All the sort of the sex scandals and the affairs and so on, people just kind of say, well, that's just Boris. And when he sort of says all these unfortunate and sometimes quite insulting things about different groups of people, that also is sort of priced in. I mean, I've never felt with him that there was going to be a sudden revelation, whether it was in his personal life or through sort of professional misconduct, that would bring him down. I've always thought it's more like a process of attrition, and it'd be the drip, drip, drip effect. And eventually the public will just get fed up and think we've had enough. We don't want this person, we want someone who's maybe got a bit more gravitas, or somebody who has a different style, takes things maybe a little bit more seriously. But I don't think we're anywhere near that stage yet. And I think my second point is that thing to remember about Boris Johnson is that when he was mayor of London, he was like a unique example of a politician that could unify people, regardless of party. And because London was and has been and is still a Labour city for so long, it was quite a feat for a Tory mayor not just to win once but to win twice in a city like London. And he did that by reaching out and being sort of Boris Johnson man and then Boris Johnson the Tory politician, and almost actually ran and operated as an independent. And that's how he was sort of palatable to lots of people in London that might not otherwise have voted for him. So at that point, he was regarded as, lovable rogue Boris Johnson. Everybody thought he was good laugh, and sort of, didn't make any major advancements in the city when he was running it, but certainly didn't have any massive clangers, and actually injected a sort of a sense of buoyancy and optimism at a time when we were coming out of the financial crash and then went into the Olympics, that actually benefited London having an ambassador like that. And you fast forward 10 years and you look at him now, and I can't think of a more divisive politician since Margaret Thatcher. And that's because we've had obviously the Brexit referendum, which split the country right down the middle. And we've had a general election campaign, or Tory leadership campaign, and then a general election campaign, which were run with a very sort of populist touch, exemplified by things like cozying up with Donald Trump and, appearing to the lowest common denominator when he's talking about things like immigration and so on. And it is quite clearly sort of, adopted whichever position benefited him most politically, and it has worked. But what has happened is that this once unifying figure has now become somebody that divides people. And I think what we see of Boris Johnson at the moment, curtain gate, or cash for cushions, whatever we're calling it, is that if you dislike or don't support Boris Johnson anyway, all it does is confirm what you think anyway about him being a bit dodgy, having no regard for other people's money or the rules, thinking there's one set of rules for him and one set for everyone else. Whereas if you like him and you think actually he delivered on Brexit and he is a refreshing voice and I like his buoyancy and his upbeat sort of optimistic nature, then you like him even more. So it's until you have sort of that middle ground of people, that middle grouping of people that neither love him nor hate him, being influenced, and that drip 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 effect having sort of an impact, then I don't think he's going anywhere.
No, I don't think he's going anywhere soon. But do you think he will stand at the next general election? Do you think his ambition is being fulfilled and he'll get out before then, or not?
I think he's incredibly competitive, and he has been since he was a child with his siblings, all through his early journalistic career, and then in politics at varying levels, whether as a backbench MP or jostling for the leadership, or indeed as mayor. And it's the same in his personal life as well. He's very, very competitive. And I bet you he sits there now and thinks the man he wants to beat is Tony Blair. Tony Blair was the great centrist leader that managed to get enough people from the left and right to back him. The left sort of stomached him because he got Labour into power, and the sort of centre right actually quite liked some of his policies. And then he won 3 elections, and I just think Boris Johnson will be thinking, okay, so what makes a successful? What would make a party that sticks? Is basically Blairism. Is enough things to all people that they could stay in power for a long time. And actually, a conservative party, or a party that calls itself conservative, but has actually quite Labour policies, is really difficult to beat. And he's kind of like, he's actually sort of the interventionist economic approach, the sort of, so-called levelling up agenda, whatever that means, but, concentration on jobs and infrastructure and growth and all those things. He's parked his tanks on Labour's lawn, and that's really difficult for Labour to contend with. So I think that once we're through the pandemic, which he will inevitably see as his Churchillian moment, because that's just the way he thinks, unless there's any sort of major dramatic revelations that force him out of office, I think it's almost a dead cert he'll stand again. And I think he'll be desperate to beat Tony Blair and hang on as long as possible.
Fascinating to hear your thoughts, Pippa. Pippa, can I ask about you as an individual? Can you remember when your political kind of the hairs on the back of your neck started standing up regarding politics? What was the thing that got you interested? Can you recall?
Well, I think in sort of the late 90s. So, in my sort of late teenage years and early 20s, there was a huge amount of change in British politics. As I said at the beginning, I'm a Scot, and we were given the opportunity to vote for devolution. It's one of the first votes I had. I was able to take place in, having turned 18. And then obviously there was the 97 election, which, having grown up under the Tories in Scotland, and sort of associated the Tories with Thatcher, and then sort of the sleaze of John Major's era, felt like an opportunity for real change. And so that was a pretty exciting time to be, both becoming an adult and becoming politically aware. So it really was that era, both the sort of the national politics and the shift from the Tories to Labour, but also, and if you remember, the sort of, whenever you're in politics, the sort of the upbeat, celebratory, the pride in Britain and where we were in the world, and all of that Tony Blair managed to harness initially. And then also looking much more close at home with Scotland, was setting up the Scottish Parliament and feeling that actually power was returning to the people. I mean, we can debate whether that has actually happened since, but it was a very emotive time in British and Scottish politics, and that's kind of got what got me really interested, what got me hooked.
Yeah, and just explain for people who are interested. I'm interested. The role of political editor. Just give us a very brief look into the window of that role. What would a regular day look like for you, Pippa?
Well, I have a team of 6 or 7 people, and we work across the paper and online. Lots of meetings, starting the day pretty early, listening to the radio and reading all the papers, looking at the wires and working out what's going on, putting my calls into contacts in both the main parties and speaking to my team and allocating who does what story. And then we kind of see where the day takes us. And sometimes it's very sort of scripted, if you like, in that there's a big announcement or there's, you know, an event happening that, you know, you're going to be covering. It's kind of set piece event. And sometimes you're digging away on your own stories and you're, you know, trying to ignore what's happening from the day to day and sort of calling contacts and trying to stand up tips and produce your own stuff. So it's pretty varied. And one day, I mean, we've written a lot about coronavirus recently, obviously, but, you know, one day normally you could be writing about immigration, and the next day you could be writing about defence, the next day you could be writing about education in schools. And one of the things we do at the Mirror, try very hard to do, is relate politics to real people's lives. And we're less interested in the sort of I mean, I'm fascinated by, but as our readers are less interested in the internal wranglings, but of you know, the different political parties and sort of the Westminster gossip, the Westminster Bubble stuff, and more interested in how a policy might shape their lives or affect their lives. And I think that's really important in journalism, that we don't just make about this sort of this ivory tower down at Westminster, that it's about actually politics as it plays out across the country. And so that's kind of my day.
And I was struck by the Daily Mail recently with the Boris stuff. They went in quite hard on him. I was wondering where the boundary starts and stops. You know, I mean, obviously the Daily Mirror is to the left of politics, but I suppose it's about holding the left to account as well as the right. Is it? Do you find that a fine line, or if the story is worthy, you go for it?
The journalism always comes first. Regardless of you know, the political the sort of the voice of the paper and its editorial stance in terms of which political party it supports. The journalism comes first, and you've seen that with us with countless stories over the years that the Mirror has done on Labour when they were in government, and then subsequently in opposition during the Corbyn years and so on. And equally, you see it, like you mentioned, the Mail. I mean, the Mail is particularly good at sort of stepping back from its natural supporters base and holding the government to account, even if it's a Tory government. Where that changes is in the run up to elections, and that applies across the board, really, in that the papers tend to be quite sort of supportive of their own parties during that period, which is, you know, as you might expect. But for me, anyway, definitely journalism first and politics second.
You stole the thunder from my follow-up question, because the Daily Mail wouldn't have run that story 3 weeks before a general election, would they? They wouldn't have gone anywhere near it.
You'd have to ask them that. I'm not so sure at the moment, to be honest, but yeah, probably not.
Pippa, can I ask you a question about empathy in politics? I've interviewed quite a few of the political heavyweights: Alistair Campbell, George Galloway, John McDonnell, Edwina Curry, and a few people had kind of tried to tip me off about how they might be. I actually found when I've conversed with them on a one-to-one sit-down conversation like this, that I've actually found them all really very nice people, very decent, very, you know, genuine. But in Parliament, it gets into a bit of a bun fight, doesn't it? And you know, I'm quite inspired by Ardenne in New Zealand about this idea that there should be more empathy in politics. Is that something? Do you actually think we could make progress if we could sit down and argue better?
I have no doubt that we could. I mean, I slightly fear that politicians get so sort of caught up in the partisan nature of things that they find it hard to do. And because lots of them feel, on both sides, feel very profoundly that what they believe in matters and is right, they sometimes find it hard to understand or relate to somebody that might have a different point of view. But there are some unusual friendships across the House, and, you know, I do admire quite a lot of politicians on both sides for sort of reaching out regardless of their own views and being prepared to listen. I think there's an unfortunate tone which has entered our politics, and, you know, I mean, this, I suppose, isn't that new. It's got worse in the last few years. Since the Brexit debate, it became very impassioned on both sides. And I think that was really unfortunate. And the night I was most depressed ever in Parliament was during Boris Johnson had to cut short his trip to UNGA, to the UN, in the autumn of 2019, and rush back to Parliament because the Supreme Court had found the government in breach of the law over the prorogation. If you remember, they suspended Parliament in order to try and push their Brexit plans through. And so he'd rushed back from New York, and he was in the House, and there was this very sort of fierce debate going on, and Paula Sheriff, now an ex, but a Labour MP, stood up and recounted how she had been getting so much abuse online, and mentioned Joe Cox, obviously the MP who was shot by a member of the far right, and lots of MPs, not just Labour MPs, but lots of MPs, in particular women, get a huge amount of sort of grief and aggression and even threats online, which there is no place for and is completely out of order. But they were feeling very vulnerable at that moment, and I think the Prime Minister demeaned himself by, in his response, dismissing it as humbug. And yes, he did a bad day, but it really, earlier on, he and his government have been talking about sort of betrayal in the context of Brexit, and it all became very personal and very bitter. And I kind of thought, you know what, if you're a leader, it's incumbent on you to set the tone for debate, and however strongly you feel about something, people will see you as setting an example. And I had sort of MPs on both sides in tears at the end of that debate, speaking to people, bumping into them afterwards, really upset about it. And it was a real low point. And it was a highly charged atmosphere. But I still think that you set the tone from the top, and Boris Johnson failed to do that at that time.
Yeah. Thanks, Pippa. Can I ask about what I would perhaps describe as the dilution of politics? I love politics. I really do. I find it fascinating. And when I was a younger chap, there was numerous big political figures: Arthur Scargill, Heseltine, Tony Benn, Nigel Lawson, all these big political figures. And I thought they all had a voice themselves. And actually, I'm worried that it's more of a personality contest these days, that it's Boris versus Starmer. And on the back of that, in the days of paper news, there seemed to be a lot of information. Now we've got social media, and the speed of news is so fast. It's so fast moving. Do you feel that politics is diluted now? Do you think it's very different to what it was back then?
Well, there's certainly an appetite for, more all the time, and it is slightly feeding the beast with social media and 24-hour news. And I think that's quite difficult for politicians to navigate. I mean, there are still voices who are quite independent and speak out from the backbenches, or indeed the front benches, and I think actually the last Parliament, so the years between 2017 and 2019, because there were so many rebellions on both sides, it kind of became a sort of an acceptable way for backbenchers to behave, much to their whips. The whips weren't happy about it. And while, of course, 21 MPs were binned from the Tories by Boris Johnson, and they were perhaps some of them more independent voices, there are others that are still in the Tory party and still MPs that do say what they think. And, and on both sides, there are individuals who will stand up, regardless of what the party line is, and say what they believe to be right and true. And I kind of admire that, because I think it's very easy to subscribe to groupthink when you're a member of a parliamentary party. And I'm sure the bosses, the leaders, would like everyone to do what they're supposed to all the time. But actually, ultimately, to me, a politician's first responsibility is to their own constituents. And I kind of think that if individual politicians are prepared to speak up and say something different because they believe it's right for the people they represent, then good on them.
Yeah. And just extending out that political idea, I do get rather frustrated when endless hours are devoted. I'm not condoning what Boris has done with his renovation of Downing Street, but it frustrates me that that time is so much energy really and oxygen. When, you know, for example, I have a friend who works and lives in Jerusalem and has been tweeting about the political situation in Palestine and Israel that's very tense, and I'd quite like to see that on you know, maybe even on page 4, 5, or 6. But it just, this kind of news seems to get missed while we've had Brexit and we've had COVID. You know, is there a place for kind of world politics now in a tabloid newspaper?
It's a bit ironic, isn't it? It's become, you know, part of the argument for Brexit was that it would enable us to be free, if that's the right word to use, from the constraints of the European Union and to look outwards, global Britain, you know, to be able to act on our own in the world stage. And yet, actually, what it seems to have done is to have made us more insular and more inward looking and more concerned about internal arguments than what's happening elsewhere. And there are some international stories which cut through, and international political stories which cut through. US elections are always one of them that gets lots of coverage in tabloids and beyond. But I actually agree with you. I think it'd be great if we could, you know, look broader and wider. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because newspapers, and not just my own, but all newspapers will try and give their readers what they think their readers want. But actually, I think sometimes there's a responsibility on editors to make a decision that a reader might not think they want this, but this is something that we, as their main source of news, should be telling them. And that, of course, that happens sometimes, but probably not enough.
Yeah. And if I could ask about the Westminster Bubble, Pippa, you're from Scotland. I wasn't too sure what the Westminster Bubble was actually, and then it was only when I featured in the news report in Burnley that I had an awful lot of people from central London who got in touch and just said they didn't know it was like that. You know, we were featured on there for some social issues. Is there just explain this Westminster Bubble too? How far does it extend? Does it extend as far as Middle England? I mean, is it?
It's partly about sort of, you know, the gossip and the wranglings of Westminster that you would find in any sort of city hall or town hall at different scales, but you'd find across the country. But and I mean, that's just going to happen anywhere you have a group of people working on something, working in politics. But I guess the Westminster Bubble, as in you're aware of what's happening in Westminster, but either don't know or don't care about what happens outside of Westminster, I think is overstated. Because I think if you look at politicians who represent all different parts of the country, they're coming to Westminster and talking about it the whole time. But I do think there's a problem with diversity in representation, both in the media and indeed in political life, and on every level. And I mean race, I mean gender, but I also mean class and sort of regional representation as well. And, you know, the number of white Oxbridge educated middle class men that are in the press gallery still, for example, or indeed are government advisors. You know, there's sort of a route to power. You go to a top public school, you go to Oxford, you get your PhD degree, you go and work in the Tory research department, and then you become an MP for wherever. That depresses me. And I think, you know, I think I'd love it if we could have a rule that you had to have sort of 10 years of real life experience, whatever that was, whether you're a social worker or, you know, a man of the cloth or a nurse or a teacher or whatever, a businessman, rather than having a place packed full of, you know, there's a lot of people that have sort of always worked in politics, or quite a lot of lawyers as well, but have always worked in politics. And, you know, I don't think it's fair to individuals to say that none of them can relate to what's going on in the real world. It's kind of an easy criticism to make, but it definitely is less the MPs actually, and more sort of the advisors and the party apparatchiks that I think need to get out a bit more and, you know, see what's happening in different parts of the country, but also with people with different social backgrounds.
Yeah. Pippa, if we can move on to a few church subjects now, if we may, and politics, actually. I was wondering if you think whether people in politics in media are interested in what the church has to say anymore?
Yes, because the church is one of the great institutions, isn't it? I mean, I think different. So, I mean, going right to the top with the Archbishop of Canterbury, different archbishops have had sort of taken different approaches as to how political they should be and how involved they should be. And I was very lucky pre-COVID to be invited to Lambeth Palace and to have lunch with a group of journalists and with the current Archbishop of Canterbury, and was so impressed by how he sort of saw the interlay between church and politics and social issues, and how he was prepared to sort of say and do things that might not be deemed popular because he felt it was right, and that somebody in his position had the, I guess, the platform to use and wasn't afraid of using it. And that's not always been comfortable for government, but it shouldn't be. I mean, there's kind of a responsibility on the church to speak out about what you see. And then I suppose it sort of filters down, doesn't it? I mean, I guess you're all plugged into your local politicians and seen as being voices of your communities. So, and particularly over the last 10 years of austerity, and we've seen during the pandemic, people have been terribly badly affected, and this was the rise of food banks. And you know, you mentioned how you'd been in the media, and people have sort of not been aware of how things were on the ground in you know, your bit of Burnley. You know, you'd have ministers right across the country really plugged into the communities in that way, and I think it's important that you use your platform to share that. So I think from that point of view, the church is sort of held in high regard and is listened to. I think there is still, when you come to sort of social issues, it gets a bit more controversial, doesn't it? You know, you've rise over women bishops and homosexuality and all sorts of other things. And you know, with the Catholic Church, sort of historic sexual abuse, and these are issues which are difficult to talk about and don't necessarily show the church as an institution in a great light always, but you know, the church wouldn't be alone as an institution to having to deal with some of them, and or to deal with complex issues. And I think as we're sort of moving into the modern age, or we're already in the modern age, but you know, moving forward, the church needs to be bold and stand up and kind of sort of, you know, move with the times. So I think there's two quite distinct sort of ways that the church is seen in public life.
I just want to ask a question about sexuality, and we've launched this big project called Living in Love and Faith in the church about how we can argue better. But do you think if the church could solve the issue of same-sex relationships in terms of moving forward, do you think that would give them more credibility, or there are some people in the church who would say, well, actually, no, it's our job to slow down these things? We, you know, you just a moment or two ago said about moving with the times, and I'm with you on that. But there is there's a large group of people just saying, well, no, we actually need to slow this right down, and you know, but I do wonder if people on the outside of church just think we're just you know, way off the pace really, and we're irrelevant in that matter.
Isn't there a difference between the people that are is there not a difference between the people that are leading the church, whether you're talking at a parish level or, you know, a sort of a national level, regional level, and congregations? And if you have people at a leadership level that are wanting to sort of press ahead, but possibly some congregations are wanting to pull back, then the ultimate outcome is that you move ahead slowly. And maybe that's just what you need to accept, that that's the way it is. There will be people within the institution that will be pushing faster than others are comfortable with. And if you are having that conversation and wanting to take people with you, then, you know, the pace of change may be slightly slower than you might like as a result, but as long as there is a sort of a pace of change. And I think the more that people see, the more that people see in their own lives, you know, I don't know, they might be sort of a devout churchgoer, but their nephew has got married to another man and they love their nephew to bits, and, you know, they love their nephew's husband to bits. Then suddenly they can relate sort of like the theological argument with the real life situation, and it becomes easier almost. So yeah.
those kind of conversations, Pippa, would they ever make the Daily Mirror?
What conversations about how the church is adapting to?
About is it of interest? Is it of national interest? And what we think?
We're big. We're. I mean, well, obviously, issues within the church are of national interest. We at the Mirror are particularly into talking. I mean, we've got sort of Britain Talks as one of our sort of, I'm not sure whether you'd call it a campaign, but it's an initiative that we set up after Brexit because, unlike most newspapers, our readership was actually quite split down the middle. I mean, slightly more Remain than Leave, but you'd have the Guardian that was overwhelmingly Remain, and the Times and so on, and then you had like the Mail and the Express and the Sun, which were more pro-Brexit. And the Mirror, we've had to tread quite a careful line, much like sort of the Labour Party has actually, because lots of our sort of traditional longer-term readers were pro-Brexit, and while the Mirror as an institution might not have been, we obviously have to respect our readers and represent them. So we set up this project, Britain Talks, and brought people from different walks of life together, and that's something which we've continued. And it's featured in the paper, but obviously we have a digital platform, a big digital platform, and Reach, the company which owns the Mirror, is the biggest owner of regional and local newspapers in Britain as well. So there's definitely an interest in bringing people together and what we can play as a national media institution to do that. And I know it's only a tiny part of the picture, but you kind of feel you've got to start somewhere and got to do something.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point because, I mean, in Burnley, we, this time went Conservative, which was very surprising, even in the context of Brexit. And I remember the days where the Tories would all buy the Sun and the Labour folk would all buy the Mirror. And now Burnley's a real hotspot of different things, really. And Labour have got quite a battle on, haven't they, to regain that ground. Do you think Keir Starmer is the man to do that for the Labour Party?
Well, I think time will tell on that one. I mean, the Labour Party had, in terms of being an electoral force, and obviously you can have the debate separately about Jeremy Corbyn and his policy position and the way he managed to energise a whole generation of people as Labour leader. But what was quite clear to me after the 2019 election was not just that Brexit was a factor, but in those swing seats in what we all very boringly now call the so-called red wall, seats like Burnley that had been Labour for decades and then sort of started to fall to the Tories, was that Jeremy Corbyn was not popular. And, some of that was to do with things like his position on national security, and some of it was to do with his economic stance. We've all rehearsed what it was by people who put off by Jeremy Corbyn 100 times, I'm sure, but in those areas. But when Keir Starmer was elected as the party leader, there was sort of a few things he needed to do. One of them was to sort of sort out the organisation of the party internally. A really important one was make it clear to the public that there was no place for anti-Semitism within the Labour movement, and to be really sort of firm about that. I mean, that was a real stain on the character of a party which was known for its anti-racism work for decades. And he's done those things. I think he's earned Labour a right to be listened to in those places. I think going forward, we'll see whether he's able to set out to articulate enough of a positive vision to persuade people that Labour is a valid alternative to what the government's offering. And I think that's where he's struggling at the moment. I mean, he would say, we've had a year of COVID and we've done lots, but we've got a very, very long way to go, and you can't do it all in a year. And I have some sympathy with that, but also at the same time, he needs to articulate a sort of a vision and an alternative for people, so that it's not just vote for us because these nasty evil Tories aren't going to run the country properly, but actually that people have a positive reason for voting for Labour. And I think that's what it comes down to, actually, Alex. I think if he can persuade enough people that he can set out a positive vision for an alternative future, then they have a chance. I'm not sure it'll be the next election, but maybe the one after that.
Yeah, it's very interesting times. And just finally, Pippa, on Scotland, you're up there in beautiful Scotland, place I hold very dear. Do you think the vote for independence is going to come around pretty soon, or what's your instincts about the future for Scotland?
Well, I think we'll know a lot more in the next 24 hours to see whether the SNP get the majority. If they don't get an outright majority, even with the support of the Greens, I think that they will struggle to push for a legitimate referendum too soon. If they do get the majority, then Nicola Sturgeon's made it quite clear that she doesn't want to go for a wildcat referendum of the sort we saw in Catalonia in 2017, that she wants it to be legitimate, but inevitably it's going to be challenged in the courts, and you'd end up with constitutional wrangling, probably up to the Supreme Court, over whether you could legitimately hold one. And I guess the other things, like two other points I'd make on that, are that the pandemic is still continuing. We're not out of the woods yet. Yes, things are looking a lot brighter, but as we touched on earlier, we're not out of this until we're all out of it. I mean, globally, and the world as a whole has a long way to go in that respect. And I don't think anybody's going to even really think seriously about concentrating on constitutional issues when the pandemic's still a threat. And secondly, I think is the nature of Nicola Sturgeon, and I think she's actually much more cautious than people necessarily recognise, and that while she has an internal pressure to go further and faster when it comes to a referendum, she has to balance that with whether they could actually win one. And I'd be very surprised if she embarked down the route of holding a referendum until they'd reached such a point that the polls looked like they were holding up in favour of independence, because losing one referendum in a generation is bad enough for the SNP, but if you lost two, then you're really not going to be able to return to the argument for a very long time to come.
Yeah, and just finally, Pippa, how damaging do you think the Alex Salmond situation has been on her? Do you think it could affect votes today, or even her long-term prospects as leader?
Well, I think the public don't like infighting in parties, and I think it'd be damaging from that perspective. I think that Nicola Sturgeon has a huge amount of support in that affair, in that row, not least from women, but from people sort of across the political spectrum in Scotland. So I don't think that if Alex Salmond doesn't get his seat for the Alba Party and sort of disappears out of the headlines and out of public life, I don't think it'll do her any long-term harm. But obviously, the whole row was damaging in terms of showing SNP splits, which have been, the SNP has been an incredibly disciplined party, more than any I can think of, up until this point, which is a remarkable feat. But if it starts to sort of, if the schisms start to appear, then, and that becomes more evident as time goes on, then the public won't like that. And, as we all know, the public is ultimately boss. So, they would eventually punish any party in that way at the ballot box.
Yeah, brilliant. Pippa, it's been really great listening to your expertise. It really has. And it's, I really love my politics, and I really like to get as many voices as I can, and just, they're very helpful for me.
Thank you very much for having me on. I've loved talking to you. And as you know, I've got a particular soft spot for Burnley, as my husband was born and bred there. My in-laws still live there, and we're regular visitors. So maybe at some point I'll get to meet you in person.
Yes, that'd be lovely. If you're down these parts, I'll make you a lovely cup of tea and perhaps show you St Matthew's and a few of the local cake shops.
I'll hold you to it.
Thank you, Pippa, so much. Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.